Like most British kids who went to school in the 80s and 90s, Acorn computers were the order of the day for most of my school life. Starting, of course, with the beloved BBC Micro, and they're still seeing that image of the witch from Granny's Garden. Sends shivers up my spine. If you were there, you know. And then the Acorn Archimedes came along, and by the time I left school in the late 90s, the PC had mostly taken over, running a combination of MS-DOS and Windows. But the first PCs that arrived in the library at my school actually ran something different and something that is quite forgotten today, a Windows competitor that has a lot of history. And today, we're going to be taking a look at GeoWorks. And I'm really pleased to have got my hands on this set of discs, as this video is going to be really nostalgic for me. The last time I even looked at GeoWorks would have been around 30 years ago. But one thing I didn't realise at the time is that it's actually a derivative of a very popular 8-bit operating system that you might be familiar with called GEOS. Now that stood for Graphic Environment Operating System, and I was familiar with that on the Commodore 64, and Commodore actually bundled it with some of the later C64C machines. And it was just that, basically a GUI operating system for the Commodore 64, and it was developed by Berkeley Softworks and originally released in 1986. And they also did versions for the Commodore Plus/4, the 128 and the Apple II. And I do remember my friend Sean having this on his Commodore 64, and even though he didn't have a mouse, he had to control it with a keyboard or a joystick. I thought it looked amazing at the time, and it reminded me very much of the Mac operating system, having used my first Apple Macintosh around the same time. And then in 1990, they released what was originally titled PC/GEOS for the IBM PC and compatibles. Now, just in case you're curious, this is not actually backwards compatible with the older 8-bit versions. Sadly, there is no inbuilt Commodore 64 emulator, although that would have been very cool. And it went through a few different names over the years, but this is the exact version that I used at school back in the day. GeoWorks Ensemble version 1.2, originally released in 1991. Now this ships on 3 high-density 1.4 megabyte floppy disks, and there was also a version that shipped on 10 5.25-inch floppies that you could get as well. And to install GeoWorks, you do need to have DOS already installed on your PC, which technically, I guess you could argue, doesn't make GeoWorks a full operating system. It's a bit more of a graphical front end, but there are programs that you can run specifically written for GeoWorks that don't work under DOS, so I'll let you decide on your own definition. I'm sure that's a debate that will continue in YouTube comments for years to come. But it probably wasn't much of an issue anyway, as pretty much everybody had it. MS-DOS came with almost all IBM PC compatibles that you could buy by 1991. So we're going to install GeoWorks and give it a try on an old PC. And the thing about GeoWorks is it actually advertised itself as needing really low system requirements. I actually remember trying this at home on an old Amstrad 8086 PC that I had, and it ran pretty decent on that back in the mid-90s as well. So running through the pretty standard installer, we are then greeted with our first glance at the welcome screen. And just before we explore that a bit more, I wanted to take a moment to give a big thank you to my sponsor, PCBWay. Now you know about PCBWay. They offer top quality, fast turnaround PCBs and also services like 3D printing and CNC milling, and they're massive supporters of the retro community. Have a look at their shared projects page and you can explore so many incredible retro designs and hardware. So check them out and get a quote today at PCBWay.com. Alright then, so time to jump into GeoWorks and see exactly what this can do. Now, upon launching it from MS-DOS, this is the first screen that we are greeted with, the appropriately titled Welcome Screen, with a rather nice GeoWorks Ensemble logo, here nice and large in the center, bit of copyright information and a cheeky serial number if you are in need of one, and what should be today's date and time listed here across the middle, which looks to be incorrect on this machine. Maybe it's a Y2K problem, but yeah, normally that will be displayed there. And you got to bear in mind that when this came out in 1991, the typical PC user of the day was probably using MS-DOS for most of their file management and launching programs, which if you're around in that era, you'll know that MS-DOS was really anything but user-friendly for new computer users. You know, still might have nightmares about IRQ conflicts and DMA channels and all that kind of thing. Well, GeoWorks attempted to take all of the complexity and the headache out of using a typical PC of the time, and actually it gives you different skill levels depending on how comfortable you are with using computers. So the most basic mode is here. It's called appliances. And if I click on that, it will give you really the bare minimum that you need to run a small business or a home office. So the first application that we see here, and if I click on these, they all launch in full screen in this mode, is a calendar. And you can literally just add tasks in here. Let's do, you see there's a couple I've already put in there. Let's do make a 4th YouTube video, as I haven't made any for a while, so we can put that in there. And you can even print out the month or the events as well, and then you can have a physical printout of that, and probably put it into your Filofax if you're a businessman back in the early 90s. And speaking of which, actually, the address book program really does look very similar to a physical Filofax. And you can see here there's even an option to put in a car phone number for all of the early 90s yuppie businessmen. And one feature that I really liked about the address book program is that it's got this dial a number feature. So say you wanted to call Clive from accounts, for example, you'd click on his name in here. Whatever number is listed at the top there, you could press on that, and then assuming you had a voice modem or a telephone line that split between your computer and a landline on your desk, you could click on dial a number and it would actually send the dial tones to your phone. So rather than having to manually input the numbers, your computer could dial the number, you wait for them to answer, pick up your handset, and then have a conversation with them. So, yeah, that was I imagine, quite a time saver back in the day, having all your different addresses and phone numbers, being able to click on them and just get the machine to dial the phone number for you. Next, we've got what, for me, was the killer app of GeoWorks when I was a kid. And you've probably seen similar programs to this before, where you can make these huge banners on your dot matrix printer on tractor feed paper. And I used to mess around with this loads, and anything we were celebrating around the house, birthdays, Christmas, I'd always think of some excuse to print out one of these banners. And it was quite flexible actually as well, with a variety of fonts that you can select here, which actually is a good opportunity to quickly show you how nice the fonts look in GeoWorks, as it actually uses scalable outline fonts. And I remember the printouts looking absolutely gorgeous, even on a basic 9-pin dot matrix printer that looked really smooth. And actually, the print system of GeoWorks was a lot better than using something like Windows back in the day. So the font technology and the printers in here as well. From memory, I had like a massive selection of printers that you could choose from as well, which we'll look into in a bit more detail soon. But you can also do things like 3D effects on the images here as well, on the font rather. You can make it bold, make it italic, and as you can see, it is scaling this all in real time as well. So yeah, that was a really good example of just how good the font and print technology was in GeoWorks by using vectors. So yeah, I remember using that quite a lot back in the day. Solitaire, which I must admit, I'm not really much of a solitaire player, but looks pretty standard from what I can see. Obviously, that's something that was present in Windows back in the day, so something that would have been a bit of a time waster in offices back in the 90s. Then we've got a calculator here as well, pretty basic one. I do like the fact that the font in here emulates a physical calculator. That's quite nice. And finally in this mode, we've got a notepad program as well, which if I type something in here, we can see that it is very basic, the options that you get in here. We can change the font to 3 different settings, small, medium, or large. There's cut, copy, and paste in here as well, an option to print, and page up and page down. You might be thinking there was one really big omission here. Even if I right-click my mouse, right now you can see there are no menus popping up. How on earth do you save your documents? Because obviously if you can't save, that's a pretty big problem. But if you do click on exit, and even if now I was to reboot the machine or turn it off and come back to it later, next time you open the Notepad program, it auto-saves and will resume from wherever you were when you were last working on the document, which obviously it means you can only work on one document at a time. But again, for someone who's really, really new and a real novice of using computers back then, I think this was actually quite a nice feature that you wouldn't have to worry about saving it yourself. It would actually automatically resume what you were working on last time. And just one final thing to show you in this applications mode is this menu that we've got at the top here, the help button. So if I press on that, you'll see that actually GeoWorks includes some online help. And this is actually context aware. So right now, I press on help, it brings up some information on using the Notepad program. If I come out of that and we go into the calculator, click on help again, and now it will bring me some help documentation on using this appliance. So again, I mean, we're talking about novice users. Having this always available at the click of a button, I think, is obviously a lot more user-friendly than having a big paper manual on the desk and having to find the relevant section in there, which really was the standard thing to do at the time. But obviously, this channel, we like to go a little bit geekier, a little bit more in-depth, so we'll come out of the appliance mode, and using the professional mode is where we really get to tap into the real power of GeoWorks.
Hold on to your butts.
And this is a bit more like it. Now, if you're using a graphical user interface in this era, back in the early 90s, this will look very familiar and you'll feel very at home here. In fact, one thing that really stands out to me looking at this is how similar it looks to the common desktop environment, CDE, that was very prevalent on Unix workstations back in this era. Now, obviously, GeoWorks is not Unix-based. It is entirely its own thing. But the way this works and the way it looks is pretty much identical to CDE. And I've got a feeling that could be because the applications for GeoWorks, the development environment, was actually on high-end Unix-based Sun workstations. So maybe the developers just felt really at home having this kind of look and this user interface. That did also mean, though, that if you wanted to develop applications for GeoWorks, you needed to have quite a bit of cash in the bank because, these machines were tens of thousands of dollars, which I imagine would have been quite a big barrier to entry for smaller companies and people that wanted to write their own applications at home for GeoWorks, which could have been another reason why it didn't take off as well as something like Windows, for example. But the view here that we have, you can see in GeoManager, we've got, all the standard menus are in here as well that we didn't get in the applications basic mode that we saw a moment ago. We also have a trash can / recycle bin down here as well, which I don't think Windows actually had in this era, back in the Windows 3.0 era. So GeoWorks is definitely ahead of it there. And we also have a mode for looking full screen here, a full maximized window view, or being able to see our active windows cascaded next to each other. And now this view that we're seeing here is actually the world view. You click on that world icon there, and it shows you your currently installed applications. Next to that, clicking on the papers, we see our documents on our hard disk, and you can see the path here as well, C/GeoWorks/document, and it is possible to save directly to a file, and there are several included examples, some of which we might have a look at in just a moment. And next to that, you can see some really obvious buttons for our installed drives on this machine, so you can navigate all your directories on your hard disk, and even you can see here all these DOS icons on DOS scripts and executables. You can launch DOS programs directly from within GeoWorks. Now, if I was to click one of these, it would take me out of the GeoManager and drop me back into MS-DOS, but it is possible to have shortcuts for your most used DOS programs. Again, really focusing on that user experience and making it very friendly. So going back into here, I can show you a quick example of the power that is kind of hiding inside GeoWorks with this little demonstration. We'll click on the extras folder here, and this 3D font demo. Again, another nice example of the outline font technology, scaling that and animating that in real time. So we'll run that, and then we'll open another one. Now this one is called Bounce. I'll click on that. See, the graphics are moving there. I can move that out of the way. And we'll see that they are running at the same time. And yeah, GeoWorks is fully preemptive multitasking. It's multi-threaded as well. And bearing in mind that this could run comfortably on even an IBM XT-based system. And it came on just 3 floppy disks. Really it was very optimized and very powerful for the time. So it really is a wolf in sheep's clothing, really. So we'll come out of that now, and we'll check out a few of the installed applications that are available to us in the GeoManager mode. Now, the first thing that your eyes may have been drawn to is this America Online icon. So if I double click that, we actually do have an AOL client included here. Now, this is the AOL that became much more famous in the late 90s and early 2000s, that in this era, you can see it was copyrighted to Quantum Computer Services, that I think was actually a bit of a throwback to when they were called Quantum Link, weren't they, on the Commodore 64, when it was a C64 BBS-based service. And the reason that the AOL client is included with GeoWorks is they actually had a deal with America Online, and if you were a customer at the time and you weren't running Windows, AOL would actually send you a floppy disk with a cut-down version of GeoWorks on there that would launch directly into this AOL client here. And I did read online that it is actually possible to kind of break out of the client and go into proper GeoWorks on a self-booting single floppy disk, obviously without all of the applications installed as well, but yeah, you could break out from it. So this deal actually lasted for a couple of years before Windows really took over and they abandoned it. But yeah, so America Online and GeoWorks had a relationship in this time, which is why it was included. We can open the calculator app from here as well, which you might be thinking looks quite similar to the calculator that we're looking at in the basic appliances mode. And that's because it's actually the same program. Only this time we can resize it. We can move it around. We also have some menus launching it in this mode too. We can change the look of it there. The thing is that this is the same program, but GeoWorks applications are able to adjust their user interface. And this is a lot more advanced than just skinning. You could, for example, have menus displaying as buttons or various features visible or not, depending on how the user wants it and the skill level. For example, here, if I open the Notepad program, you can see that text that we entered before. It is the exact same program, only this time we can now save as, and we can enter a name for the file. So that is really powerful, and I'll show you a little bit more on that later, but obviously goes way beyond just a simple skin of an application. We've also got a terminal program, that Geodex program that we saw before as well. Also included are a couple of other applications that we didn't get in the basic mode, like GeoDraw, that upon first glance, you might be thinking is just a basic kind of Microsoft Paint clone, but actually there is a lot more to it than that. If I open one of the included templates, for example, let's go into the samples drawer, check out the cafe menu. You can see that actually GeoDraw has some pretty fully featured desktop publishing features. So using that for a menu, we can check out another included example here as well, a homeowner's letter. Yeah, making like newsletters and newspapers as well. So definitely a lot more advanced than something like Microsoft Paint. The fact that it's got these DTP features in here as well. So yeah, really powerful actually, and very nice. And again, the print engine of GeoWorks is really nice. So these would have looked beautiful. This is all WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get on the page, which wasn't all that common back in the early 90s. So this is definitely quite advanced for the time. We also have the Notepad program that we saw before, obviously. GeoWrite though, which is more advanced. And as you can see from this mode, again, we'll open an example so we can see a bit more of its power. Let's have a look in templates. Some business templates in here as well. Letters. Let's open a letterhead. There you go. You can just fill that in. And again, a lot of these templates are included here as well. One for resumes and all that kind of thing too. So these are really handy to have in your small business that you're running back in the early 90s. A lot of features in here as well, like fonts, changing sizes of them as well. A lot of formatting options. Although quite annoyingly, because I do remember using this back in the day, there wasn't stuff like a thesaurus built in. Although I think it did have a basic spell checker that were included here too. So for what it was back in the early 90s, and bearing in mind that the competition at the time would have been something like WordPerfect, and the fact that again this could print out WYSIWYG and they'd look pretty much the same on the paper that it would on your screen. I do remember the printouts of this looking really nice, so that was nice to include here as well. Yeah, we've got a couple of other things like scrapbook, the preferences panel we can go into and change things like the background in GeoWorks. So if I was to move that down, we see a few of them in here. The GeoWorks logo, we'll apply that. There it is, which is hidden by the preferences program. There were a few other ones included too, which, yeah, as you'd imagine, pretty much all of them look very garish and early 90s. And you can even go quite advanced in here as well, even changing stuff like your swap file for virtual memory from here too. So, yeah, you can get a lot more advanced with this version, this mode of GeoWorks, than you could in the basic appliances mode. And finally, one other thing just to point out in here, something that actually wasted a hell of a lot of time back in my IT classes at school, was the inclusion of a rather nice Tetris game. Now, I can't remember what the keys are for this. There we go, rotating that. And there's no way I'm going to be able to play this and talk at the same time. But really nice. And actually, I do remember that you could actually have, if we go and see, and we'll stop this, about the current game, you could have two-player competitive Tetris. So you'd have to kind of swap it up, one player on the left side of the keyboard, one on the right. But yeah, this was so cool, having a competitive Tetris game included in an operating system. And yeah, this was something that got past our IT managers at school back in the day, so we did spend quite a bit of time on this. So very nice version of Tetris. And as you can see, even Alexei Pajitnov, the original creator of Tetris, gets a little nod here in the help documentation. So that's been a look at the version of GeoWorks that I used at school back in the day, version 1.2. But the story doesn't end there. There is more to it. In 1993, we got version 2.0 of GeoWorks. Now, as you can see, the UI looks very similar to version 1, but there are some nice upgrades here. For example, it detected my CD-ROM drive, increasingly important as we got into the mid-90s, and we've got a large always visible clock down here in the bottom right of the screen, which you can actually view in a few different modes, including a rather weird one named Herman, which at first I thought was some of those desktop eyes that follow your cursor around the screen, but apparently they don't. And this version launches directly into the Geo Manager instead of the basic appliances mode. But what they've done here is really taken advantage of the flexible modular user interface. And here, the user can now choose their skill level by application, and it will change the UI elements on the fly. Pretty impressive. And there are a few new applications bundled, including GeoCalc, which is actually a pretty decent spreadsheet program. Now, around this time, some interesting things were happening behind the scenes with GeoWorks. Microsoft actually approached them and offered to buy the platform. And according to a quote from Brian Doherty, the CEO of Berkeley Works, who by now had renamed themselves as GeoWorks Corporation,
Bill Gates was actually very charming. Ballmer was the hammer. I met with Bill and several of the engineers on the Windows development team. They were complimentary of what we had done and talked about joining forces to work on the next version of Windows. I should have listened to them, especially considering how Microsoft stock appreciated from 1989 on. Ballmer was the bad cop. He came in and said, "Look, if you don't sell or license to us, we really have to crush you. We can't afford to have a competing PC operating system." I don't think he was trying to be mean or intimidating. It was just matter of fact.
The team at GeoWorks bravely decided to say no to Microsoft, but around the same time, they were also in conversations with Apple.
We actually got into extensive discussions with Apple about developing a low-cost notebook that would run GEOS with the Mac UI. It got killed by the hardware group doing Mac notebooks, but it went all the way to a board meeting we attended with CEO John Scully before it died.
How different things could have been. Now, by now, Windows 3.1 was becoming dominant on the desktop, and after a successful IPO in 1994 to inject much-needed cash into the company, GeoWorks refocused their efforts on the emerging PDA market. Now, obviously, having a lightweight operating system was perfect for the limited processing power and memory constraints of early PDAs, and a trimmed-down version of GeoWorks powered devices like the Tandy Zoomer that was developed in 1993, the HP Omnigo 100, released in 1995, and even the Nokia 9000 communicator, which many people claim was actually the first ever smartphone. That wasn't the end of GeoWorks on the desktop though, and in 1996, a company called New Deal Inc., based in Somerville, Massachusetts, was founded by some former GeoWorks employees and licensed the GeoWorks desktop OS. Their new version was renamed New Deal Office, and it was aimed at a similar market as before, small businesses and home users and people who had lower-end PCs that weren't quite up to the job of running the behemoth that was Windows 95. And this is New Deal Office 2000, and now obviously it's got that late 90s trend of naming everything 2000 to seem cutting edge and next millennium. And as you can see, the user interface is very different here. Obviously, a lot more in the style of Windows 95. We've even got a start button in the bottom left of the screen, which again looks very similar to the Windows menu, but this shortcut menu actually dates all the way back to GeoWorks version 1. Now, I forgot to mention this earlier, but on GeoWorks 1.2, you can actually click the little E button in Windows from anywhere, and it brings up a handy menu where you can launch programs. And the reason for this is, yeah, as you guessed it, it is actually the same OS under the hood. They've just updated it with a new user interface style. But actually, if you want proof of that, you can go into the settings and change it back to the classic motif style. Now, giving it a quick restart here, and there it is. Looking very familiar. Good old comfortable GeoWorks. And they also offer a easy desktop UI mode, which pretty much reinstates the original appliances mode, but I've got to admit, looks a little bit garish in a 16 color mode that I've got this running on currently. But going back to the new UI mode, we can see that it's obviously all heavily influenced by Windows 95, that, to be fair, was the biggest deal in computers at the time. And everything from the colors to the window title bars and the layout of the window gadgets. And to view the drives, we click on an icon called Computer, and we can navigate our disk from here. It all feels very familiar if you've used Windows 95 before. And there are some new applications included here. Now, I won't go through them all, as a lot of these are really the same apps that we saw in GeoWorks, just renamed new. For example, GeoWrite is now called NewWrite, but they're not kidding us. When we click on this, we can see that actually it is pretty much just a slightly updated version of GeoWrite with a new name. And obviously, by the mid-90s, the internet was a big deal, and New Deal Office includes some pretty decent net applications. Now, we've got a web browser called Skipper. See, everyone talks about Netscape and Internet Explorer in the browser wars back in the 90s. Everyone forgets Skipper. I'm not online here, but there is some local HTML files bundled on the disk, so we can see how it works. And they even include an e-store where you could order other New Deal packages. And it looks decent enough, and they've actually upgraded the included online help documentation into HTML format, which is a nice touch. And there's also an HTML editor to build your own web pages. So you could have made a pretty decent HTML 1.0 page in here and then uploaded it to your GeoWorks storage space. And they include an IRC client called WebChat. Now, amazingly, GeoWorks survived well into the 2000s and even into the 2010s. And New Deal Inc. went out of business in the year 2000. And after that, a company called Breadbox bought the rights to GeoWorks in 2001. And they continued to make upgrades and improvements. And actually, they were marketing their version of GEOS as an operating system aimed to revive old PCs and as an affordable solution for the educational market, requiring only a PC with a 486 processor and at least 8 megabytes of RAM. And this is the final commercial release of GEOS, this time called Breadbox Ensemble version 4.1.3. Now, this was released in 2009, and on the surface of it, again, it looks very similar to the earlier releases, still using that Windows 95 style user interface, which by the time this was released, 2009, Windows 7 was on the market by now, so this was starting to look a little bit long in the tooth. But they did upgrade the included tools for the 21st century. We've got some essentials like a PDF viewer included. There's also an updated web browser, this time called WebMagic, although using it, it still very much feels like a mid-90s browser. Doesn't feel all that modern, bearing in mind that, Chrome was out by this point. And they also include some more internet tools, including a newsreader, instant messenger, and an email application. And the classic GeoWorks Office suite, dating back to the early 90s, is still included here, admittedly with some slight upgrades, including the ability to load Microsoft Word created documents, which of course is essential in the modern day, but under the surface, still very much the same program. As are a lot of the other included applications. Now, some of them have been given slight UI tweaks or name changes, but really at heart, most of these are the same applications that were almost 20 years old by the time this version of the OS was released. And in fact, it was still on sale until the mid-2010s. And at this stage, a port of GEOS to Android devices was apparently in the works. But sadly, Breadbox company founder and owner Frank Fisher died of a heart attack in 2015, and the company quickly ceased all operations. And amazingly, even that didn't stop GeoWorks, and in fact, it still continues in a form to this day. Now, former employee Falk Rehwagen managed to get Frank's family to agree to let him open source the operating system, and the FreeGEOS project was born in 2018. Now, this is mostly just the source code of the final version 4.1.3 from what I can see, but there are a small team of contributors who are currently working to polish this up into a new release. And looking at the dates on here, the latest commits were just 2 days ago at the time of recording this video. So hopefully, we haven't seen the end of GeoWorks. And even though it didn't end up being the Windows killer that Berkeley Softworks were probably hoping that it would be back in the early 90s, to be honest, it's just incredible that this system, which has its roots back on the Commodore 64 and the Apple II, has got any signs of life left in it today. And it is interesting to see that work is progressing, admittedly at what appears to be quite a slow pace. So if you want to check out the current state of GeoWorks and maybe even join and contribute to the effort yourself, I will link up the GitHub in this video description. So it's been really interesting and very nostalgic for me exploring GeoWorks again and seeing a bit more about its rather checkered history. So if you've got any memories you'd like to share, I always love reading your comments. Maybe you were a GeoWorks user back in the day. And also a reminder that I do a weekly retro gaming and technology podcast called The Retro Hour. Now, new episodes are released every Friday. You can find it on all the major platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, here on YouTube as well. And we bring it up to speed on what's been happening, the big news stories from the last week in the world of retro, and we interview industry legends every week on the podcast. In fact, we've got Chris Hulsbeck joining us on the show this week. So you can find new episodes every Friday. Head to our website, theretrohour.com. And while you're here on YouTube, here are a couple more of my videos I think you might enjoy. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.